Thursday morning, January 15th, 2026. Silver leaves, Phillip Island. The coastal air is already warming, even though it's barely 8:30. Riley, Wine's Eel, and his plumbing crew have been at the holiday rental on Hazelwood Court since dawn, excavating for a new septic tank. It's routine work. Dig the hole, lay the pipes, move on to the next job. The excavator's bucket bites into the sandy soil. Lifts, swings, dumps, over and over. Methodical. Ordinary. Until it isn't. Riley's watching the latest bucket load spill across the ground when something catches his eye. Something that doesn't belong in the sand and soil 50 centimetres below the surface of a regular coastal property. Something pale, curved, unmistakable. It's a skull. The crew stops work immediately. They gather round. Looking closer now, they can see more bones scattered in the disturbed earth. Adult size. Human. There's no remnants of clothing, nothing to identify the remains, nothing to say who this was or how long they've been there. It's just bones that have been waiting in the sand for someone to find them. The house was built in the 1980s. The original owners lived there for about 20 years before it became a holiday rental. Which means these remains could have been there for decades. Which means, for anyone who knows Phillip Island's darkest secret, there's one immediate question hanging thick in the salt air. After 40 years, has Vivian Cameron finally been found? Welcome to Struth, a podcast that explores Australia's most perplexing mysteries. And today's mystery has potentially unearthed itself in the most dramatic fashion in recent weeks. To understand what the bones found in the opening scene might mean, who they might belong to, and why their discovery sent shockwaves through a community that spent 4 decades trying to forget, we need to go back to September 1986. Back to a small island connected to the mainland by a single bridge. Back to a love triangle that ended in brutal murder and an impossible disappearance. Back to a night where everything went wrong. Phillip Island sits 140 kilometres south of Melbourne, a 26 kilometre stretch of farming and tourist country jutting into Bass Strait. In 1986, about 5,000 people called it home. It was a tight-knit community where everybody knew everybody, where secrets were hard to keep and even harder to escape. The island was, and still is, famous for 2 things. The nightly penguin parade where thousands of tourists gathered to watch the little penguins waddle ashore, and the Phillip Island Grand Prix circuit where motorcycles scream around curves that hug the coastal cliffs. The island's connected to mainland Victoria at San Remo by a single concrete bridge, 640 metres of 2-lane roadway suspended above deep water. 8 to 10 knot currents run through the channel. White pointer sharks patrol the depths. It's the only way on or off the island by car. That single choke point, that one exit, will become crucial to understanding what might have happened in this mystery. The first member of our love triangle is Beth Barnard. She was born on Christmas Day 1962. A Christmas baby who grew into a woman friends described as bubbly, charming, attractive, popular, In 1984, at 21, she'd moved to Phillip Island looking for adventure and took a job at the Penguin Parade, connecting with the tourists and working with the volunteers. She absolutely loved the work. One of those volunteers was Fergus Cameron. Fergus was 35 in 1984, 13 years older than Beth, already married with 2 young sons. The Cameron family that Fergus belonged to were island royalty. They owned substantial farming property, and Fergus was a founding shareholder in the Grand Prix circuit. They had money, influence, and deep roots in the community. Fergus himself was charming, successful, and embedded in island life in ways outsiders could never be. In April 1985, he employed Beth as a farmhand on the family property at Watts Road, Ventnor, and within a month, they were lovers. It became what locals described as an open secret. Everyone knew. No one talked about it directly, of course. That's how small communities work. The information spreads like fire through dry grass, but confronting it openly, that would violate unspoken rules about minding your own business, about not making waves, about protecting the prominent families who've been here for generations. But importantly, Fergus's wife, Vivian Cameron, knew. Vivian was 35, originally from Melbourne. She'd married Fergus in the late 1970s and moved to the island, but she'd never quite fit in. The island didn't always welcome outsiders, especially outsiders who'd married into prominent families. She had 2 young sons, Dougal and Hugh, and friends described her as a devoted mother who loved her boys intensely, fiercely. There was something else about Vivian that matters in this story. When she was 8 years old, her own father had abandoned the family for a younger woman. The trauma of that abandonment lived in her, and now, watching her husband slip away to a younger woman, it felt as though history was repeating itself. Through 1986, people around her noticed changes. Vivian lost weight, she coloured her hair, she begged Fergus to attend marriage counselling. Some friends said she was planning to leave him. Others said she was desperate to save the marriage. The truth was probably both. The contradictory desperation of someone watching their life unravel and trying to do anything they could to stop it. September 22nd, 1986. Monday evening on Phillip Island. The day's warmth was fading into that particular coastal cold that makes you reach for a jumper, even in the early spring. First, we're going to walk through what we know happened that night, and we're going to pay very careful attention to the details that don't quite fit. Because in mysteries like this one, those awkward details that everyone wants to ignore are usually the ones that matter most. Fergus Cameron spent part of this evening at Beth Barnard's farmhouse in Rhyl. Beth lived alone in the rented property, tucked away among the paddocks in that isolated way that farming country creates. Your nearest neighbour close enough to hear a vehicle pass, but far enough to make it seem that you're truly on your own. So there they were, just the 2 of them, Fergus and Beth, 17 months into an affair that everyone on the island knew about, but nobody discussed directly. According to Beth's closest friends, she'd been steeling herself for weeks to have a particular conversation that night. She was going to give Fergus an ultimatum, force him to make the choice he'd been avoiding since their affair began. His marriage or their relationship. No more being the secret everyone whispered about. No more being the other woman. Choose, or she was done. Whether that conversation actually happened, we'll never know for certain, because Beth never got the chance to tell her side of the story. But we do know that something occurred in that farmhouse that evening that set everything else in motion. It started a sequence of events that would end in violence and a disappearance and 40 years of unanswered questions. At approximately 9 p.m, Fergus leaves Beth's farmhouse to drive home. The distance wasn't far. Nothing on Phillip Island is truly far when you measure it in kilometres. But what had happened at Beth's place was about to collide violently with what was waiting for him at home. Earlier that evening, while Fergus was still at Beth's farmhouse, Vivian had been making phone calls. She rang the Penguin Parade where Fergus volunteered, asking to speak with him. He told her he'd be working late, but when she called, they told her he wasn't in. The lie confirmed what she'd suspected for months. When Fergus walked through the door of the Cameron house at 9:20, Vivian was waiting for him. But she wasn't alone. Fergus's sister, Marnie Cairns, was there too. She'd come over earlier that evening to visit, to share a glass of wine, the kind of casual family drop-in that was perfectly normal on an island where everyone was related to everyone else, and your family's business was never quite your own. It's important to remember that Marnie was there that evening. Remember that her presence means she witnessed at least some of what happened next. Her testimony about those events would become crucial to the official story, so it's worth keeping in mind exactly what position she was in to see and hear and later recount. According to a police statement that Fergus made later on, and we need to remember that this is Fergus's version, Vivian confronted him about the affair the moment he walked through the door. The argument escalated quickly from accusation to rage. She grabbed a wine glass and in her fury at his betrayal, she attacked him with it, slashing his ear and cutting his back badly enough that the wounds would require proper medical treatment with stitches and bandaging. Police would later confirm that there was definitely blood found in the Cameron house that night. That much is verified and documented. 2 types of blood that police later collected and tested. Some blood that matched Fergus's blood type, and some blood that was type A, which was Vivian's blood type. So we know blood was spilled during whatever confrontation occurred in that house between husband and wife. But here's the first detail that doesn't quite fit into the neat story that we're being told. Later that same evening, when medical staff at Worley Hospital examined Vivian, they observed no visible injuries on her. None at all. She had no cuts, no wounds, no marks that would explain how her blood came to be spilled in the Cameron house during this violent confrontation. The nurse who treated Fergus would specifically note in her records that while Vivian appeared tense and upset, she showed no signs at that point of physical injury. So, if Vivian was injured badly enough during this fight to leave blood evidence in the house, blood that would later be collected and tested and used to establish that she'd been in a violent state that evening, where were her wounds? How do you bleed without being cut? It's a question worth keeping in the back of your mind as we move through the rest of this timeline. Marnie witnessed at least part of these events unfolding in the Cameron house. She would later tell police that she saw the violent argument between Fergus and Vivian, that she saw the blood, that she witnessed Vivian's explosive anger when the truth about the affair could no longer be denied or ignored. Her testimony would become one of the most crucial pieces supporting her brother's account, establishing in the official record that Vivian had demonstrated a violent and jealous temper that evening, that she was capable of rage, that she'd attacked her husband in fury. But of course, Family members often provide each other with support when things go terribly wrong. It's natural, it's human. Sometimes that support comes through deliberate lying. But more often it comes through a kind of willful seeing, believing what you want to believe about someone that you love, remembering events the way that makes sense of the story you need to tell yourself. At 11 p.m, Fergus and Vivian drove to Worley Hospital on the island. By now, Fergus's wounds had been bleeding for well over an hour, soaking through whatever he'd used to try and stop the flow. A nurse examined him and began treating the injuries. There were deep cuts to his ear and back that required careful cleaning and stitching to close properly. She noted in her records that the couple seemed cagey about what had actually happened, offering an implausible story about Fergus falling through a plate glass door that nobody really believed. But nobody challenged directly either. But while she was treating Fergus, the nurse also made another observation, one that would be medically documented in the hospital records. She noted, as we've already mentioned, that at that time, Vivian had no visible injuries whatsoever. No blood on her clothing, no cuts or wounds that would later require treatment. She looked tense, certainly. She looked upset, which you'd expect from someone whose marriage had just exploded into violence. But as far as the nurse could tell, she was not wounded. Another important point here is that the nurse also noted what Vivian was wearing that night. A distinctive pink mohair jumper, blue jeans, and a floral scarf around her neck. Which at first might seem like an irrelevant detail, the kind of routine observation medical staff make without thinking about. But fabric tells stories, if you know how to read them. Mohair is a particular kind of wool. It comes from Angora goats and it has very specific properties. It's soft and warm and luxurious, but it's also notorious for shedding fibres constantly. Fergus and Vivian returned home from the hospital around midnight, pulling into the driveway of the Cameron house with Fergus's wounds now properly treated and bandaged. According to Fergus's later statement to police, they sat down and had a calm discussion about divorce. Not a fight, not an argument, just a tired, resigned conversation about ending their marriage as amicably as possible. Vivian said she'd move to Melbourne. He could keep the children, keep the house, keep his life on the island. He painted it as an exhausted acceptance. He made it seem like Vivian had given up, not just on the marriage, but on her kids as well. Then, according to his statement, at around 1 o'clock in the morning, Vivian drove Fergus to his sister Marnie's house so he could stay the night there. Maybe the house felt too heavy with everything that had happened. Maybe sleeping under the same roof felt impossible. Whatever the reason, she drove him to Marnie's, dropped him off, and drove away into the darkness, still wearing that pink mohair jumper. At 3 o'clock in the morning, that deep hour of the night when phone calls always mean emergency or disaster, the telephone rang at Robin Dixon's house. Robin was a family friend, someone Vivian had known for years and someone she trusted. Robin fumbled for the phone in the darkness and answered it, and the woman on the other end of the line said she was Vivian Cameron and that she needed a favour. Could Robin please come over to the Cameron house right away and babysit the boys? She needed to take Fergus to the hospital. But as we know, not only according to Fergus's account but also hospital records, Fergus had already been to the hospital by 3 a.m, 4 hours earlier. His wounds had already been examined and cleaned and stitched and bandaged. The medical treatment was done and dusted. So why would someone be calling Robin at 3 in the morning, asking her to babysit so Vivian could take Fergus to a hospital he'd already visited? This isn't just an odd detail. It's not a simple mistake or confusion. It's a significant discrepancy in the timeline, and it tells us something important. Either the person making this phone call didn't know that Fergus had already been treated, which would be strange if it was actually Vivian calling since she'd been at the hospital with him, or they wanted Robin to believe the hospital visit hadn't happened yet, which raises even more troubling questions about what was really going on later that night. Robin Dixon drove to the Cameron house despite the strangeness of the request, because that's what you do when a friend calls at 3 a.m. saying they need help. She arrived at about 3:15 a.m. to find the house quiet. Both Cameron children asleep in their beds where they should be. Both adults were absent, which matched what the phone call had suggested, that Vivian had already left to take Fergus somewhere. Robin observed something specific that she would remember clearly later on, a detail that stuck in her mind because it seemed quite odd, even at the time. Vivian's black handbag was sitting by the back door, exactly where you'd leave it if you'd just come home and set it down without thinking. And the Kingswood sedan, Vivian's usual car, the one she drove, was also still at the property, parked in its normal spot. So if Vivian had driven Fergus to Marnie's house at 1 a.m. in one vehicle, then somehow left Marnie's and continued on to wherever she went, which car would she have been driving? Would she have taken her own familiar Kingswood? Or would she have taken the family's work Land Cruiser for some strange reason? And if she'd left the house to drive anywhere in the middle of the night, why would she have left her handbag behind? Women don't leave their handbags when they're going somewhere, even if it's just a short trip. You grab it automatically. It's got your wallet, your keys, your cigarettes if you smoke, all the necessities of movement. But Vivian's handbag, according to Robin, was sitting by the door at 3 o'clock in the morning, left behind. So let's jump over to the other side of the island at 3:30. Beth Barnard's neighbour heard something that cut through the deep silence of the rural night. It was the distinctive sound of a Toyota Land Cruiser, that particular deep rumbling diesel engine note that's different from a regular car. The neighbour noted it specifically because traffic on that isolated dirt road in the middle of the night was unusual enough to register, even in sleep. Someone was at or near Beth's farmhouse at around 3:30 in the morning. Someone driving the Cameron's family Land Cruiser, or one that sounded a lot like it. Just before dawn, at 5 a.m, when the sky was starting to show the first grey hints of light, but the sun hadn't yet broken the horizon, Wayne Hunt was beginning his shift at the bakery in New Haven. Bakers, of course, start ridiculously early, and Wayne was already up and moving when he spotted something as he drove to work. There was a vehicle parked on Forest Avenue near the San Remo Bridge, sitting there alone in that grey pre-dawn light. Remember, this is the bridge, the only bridge that can get you off Phillip Island. It was the Cameron family's Toyota Land Cruiser. As the sun came up on Tuesday, September 23rd, Robin Dixon was facing a problem. She still had the 2 Cameron children. She'd looked after them all night after that strange 3 a.m. phone call from Vivian, asking her to come babysit. But Vivian hadn't returned, and Robin couldn't reach her by phone. She needed to leave for work. So she called Donald Cameron, Fergus's brother, who also lived on the family farm. She explained the situation. Vivian had asked her to watch the boys, said she was taking Fergus to the hospital, never came back, and she now wasn't answering her phone. Donald agreed to come collect the youngest child. The eldest could catch the school bus with the Dixon children. On his drive home with the boy, Donald passed Fergus and Vivian's house. Vivian's Holden Kingswood sedan was still parked in its usual spot. But Donald didn't think to check the shed where the family's work vehicle, the Toyota Land Cruiser, was kept. At around 8 o'clock, Donald's wife Pamela called Marnie's house to find out what was happening. When Fergus answered the phone, he was so distressed he couldn't speak coherently. He couldn't get the words out. He handed the phone to Ian Cairns, his brother-in-law. Ian explained everything, the entire previous night, from the moment Fergus walked through the door. At around 9 o'clock, Ian called Donald back with the piece of information that changed everything. The family's Toyota Land Cruiser was missing. Vivian was gone. She hadn't returned for her children. She wasn't answering calls. Her own car was still at the house, but the Land Cruiser, it was gone. And suddenly, perhaps conveniently, Fergus remembered something Vivian had said the night before. On the drive to the hospital, after she'd attacked him with a wine glass, while blood was still soaking through his shirt, Vivian had said something specific. Something that had seemed like venting at the time, words spoken in rage that she'd retracted almost immediately. According to Fergus, she said, "I'm just going to get the little bitch." Now, with Vivian missing and the Land Cruiser gone, those words took on terrifying weight. Fergus had a theory about why she would have taken his vehicle instead of her own. When the Land Cruiser pulled up to Beth's isolated farmhouse in the middle of the night, Beth would see it through her window. She'd recognise it as Fergus's vehicle. She'd assume he was coming to see her. She'd open the door without fear, without question, without any sense that she might be in danger. And so Fergus asked Donald and Ian to go check on Beth immediately, to drive to her farmhouse in Rill and make sure she was all right. And here's the detail that investigators would later find significant. Fergus didn't go himself. Before driving to Beth's house, Donald and Ian first checked whether Vivian had returned to the Cameron property. She hadn't. They confirmed she wasn't anywhere on the farm. A neighbour would later tell investigators she saw Donald pull up to Marnie and Ian's house to collect Ian. She saw Fergus standing at the back door, visibly distressed. And then the two men drove across the island to Beth's farmhouse on McPhee's Road in Rill. Roughly a 13-kilometre trip through the quiet Tuesday morning. When they arrived at Beth's property, everything looked normal at first. Both of Beth's cars were parked in their usual spots. The house sat quiet among the paddocks, surrounded by that deep, rural silence where nothing seems out of place. But the back door was ajar, and the porch light was still on, burning in the morning sunlight. Donald was the first inside. He moved through the house toward the bedroom, and there he found Beth Barnard, a floral doona covering her body, concealing at first glance just how terrible this was. He called Ian in. Both men looked at what was in front of them. Both agreed she appeared to be dead. They didn't touch anything. They didn't disturb the scene. They left immediately and drove straight to the Cowes police station. It was approximately 9:05 a.m. when Donald Cameron and Ian Cairns walked into the Cowes police station and approached Sergeant Cliff Ash, who had just returned to work after a bit of time off. Donald's report was rambling, unfocused, covering everything at once. He prattled on with the whole story from start to finish, one officer would later recall. The affair between Fergus and Beth, the fight the previous night, Vivian's attack with the wine glass, her disappearance, the missing Land Cruiser, and finally, most importantly, the body they'd just found at Beth Barnard's farmhouse. Sergeant Ash immediately called for backup from the mainland. Then he and a junior officer followed Donald and Ian back to the farmhouse, arriving between 9:20 and 9:30 that morning. When Sergeant Ash removed that floral doona, the doona that had been covering Beth's body, the full horror became apparent. Her throat had been slashed so deeply that the blade had scraped against bone. Multiple wounds covered her body, slashes and stabs delivered with the kind of frenzied violence that speaks to rage beyond control. Her hands showed defensive wounds where she tried to fight back, tried to protect herself from the blade, tried to survive what was happening to her. She'd fought for her life in that bedroom, but there was something else. Something that transformed this from a murder into a symbol that would haunt Australia for 40 years. Carved deep into Beth's chest was the letter A. 4 slashes vertically, 10 slashes horizontally, 5 more cuts across them. The letter A, for adulteress perhaps, a reference to Nathaniel Hawthorne's novel The Scarlet Letter, where a woman is forced to wear the letter A as punishment for her affair. The newspapers would call it the Scarlet Letter murder, and that name would stick for decades. Within hours, Beth's isolated farmhouse was transformed into a hub of official activity. Police vehicles lined the dirt road, crime scene tape cordoned off the property, and investigators in protective gear moved methodically through the house, photographing every detail, collecting every piece of evidence. They found a knife lying near Beth's body. They found cigarette butts scattered throughout the house, Claridge and Peter Stuyvesant brands. This was significant because Beth wasn't a smoker. Her friends confirmed it, her family confirmed it. She didn't smoke. But Claridge cigarettes were Vivian Cameron's preferred brand. They found blood-stained paper towels near the bathroom sink, as if someone had tried to clean up. And outside the back door, on the path leading away from the house, they found 3 drops of type A blood. Type A was Vivian Cameron's blood type. It was not Beth Barnard's. On the surface, all of this evidence pointed directly to Vivian having been at the farmhouse. Her brand of cigarettes, her blood type, signs of a clean-up. It seemed to create a clear picture, one that made sense. But here's what you need to understand. Every single piece of evidence that I've just mentioned is mobile. Cigarettes, of course, can be carried from one location and left at another. Towels can be transported. Blood can be collected on fabric and moved. These items, without exception, could be brought to Beth's farmhouse by anyone and left there to create an impression of Vivian's presence. While investigators were still processing Beth's farmhouse that afternoon, Pamela Cameron, Donald's wife, was driving through New Haven when she spotted something on Forest Avenue near the San Remo Bridge. It was, as we'd mentioned earlier, the Cameron family's Toyota Land Cruiser, sitting abandoned with no one around. She stopped to investigate, and what she found inside would become crucial to the official story. There was Vivian's gold purse sitting on the seat. There was her black handbag, the same handbag that Robin Dixon had seen sitting by the back door of the Cameron house at 3 o'clock in the morning, which means that either Robin Dixon was mistaken or someone had gone back to the Cameron house, collected that handbag, and it was later found in the Land Cruiser. Inside the Land Cruiser, they also found 2 packets of Claridge cigarettes, Vivian's brand, and a box of matches. a blood-stained face washer, and yet another knife. The keys were still sitting in the ignition as if someone had parked in a hurry, and the windows were partially open. All of this created a picture of a woman who'd driven to this bridge in desperation and abandoned the vehicle. The vehicle parked near the bridge, the single bridge connecting Phillip Island to the mainland, the bridge suspended above those dangerous 8 to 10 knot currents, above water where white pointer sharks patrol. The theory formed immediately, almost inevitably. Vivian Cameron had discovered her husband's betrayal. She'd attacked him at home in a violent rage. Then in the early hours of the morning she'd driven to Beth's farmhouse and committed murder. She'd carved the letter A as a symbolic punishment. "You stole my husband, you adulteress." And then she'd driven to the bridge, parked the Land Cruiser, and jumped. Murder-suicide. Crime of passion. Case closed. Except Vivian's body was nowhere to be found. Police deployed divers to search the waters beneath the San Remo Bridge. For days they worked in dangerous conditions, those brutal currents that make the channel treacherous. The sharks that had been spotted in the waters, the cold and the poor visibility that make diving difficult. They searched systematically, covering the area beneath the bridge and expanding outward, looking for any sign of a body, any piece of clothing, any physical evidence that Vivian Cameron had entered that water. They found nothing, no body, no clothing, no personal effects. There was nothing on the railing of that bridge that showed a disturbance in the dust and the grime that builds up to indicate that anyone had jumped. And while it's true that bodies in water can be carried by currents, those same currents tend to bring bodies back to shore within days. The tides and currents in Bass Strait have patterns. They don't just carry things straight out forever. Bodies surface. They wash up on beaches. But no body ever surfaced. No remains ever washed ashore. Nothing of Vivian Cameron was ever found in those waters, despite days of search. So the bridge theory itself raised questions. It had been standing for decades and there was no record of anyone ever successfully committing suicide by jumping from it. Not one documented case. The bridge rises about 10 metres above the water, high enough to be dangerous, but not high enough to guarantee death on impact. Indeed, thrill-seeking teenagers jump from it quite often over the summer period. And also, if Vivian Cameron had genuinely wanted to kill herself, Phillip Island has dramatic coastal cliffs where the drop is much higher and the rocks below would make survival impossible. Those cliffs have been the site of actual suicides over the years. So if that was her intent, why would she choose a bridge where no one had ever successfully committed suicide before? In addition, friends of Vivian's came forward. They told police that there was no way, absolutely no way, that Vivian would abandon her 2 young sons. She was devoted to Dougal and Hugh. Being their mother was the core of who she was. The idea that she would kill herself and leave them motherless? Impossible. Unthinkable. And there were other details that didn't quite fit. That phone call at 3 a.m. asking to take Fergus to a hospital he'd already visited. The magical handbag that appeared in 2 different places. The type A blood at the Cameron house when Vivian at that time of night showed no injuries at the hospital. So while the immediate evidence seemed to point clearly at Vivian, when you looked more carefully, when you start asking questions, instead of accepting the obvious narrative, things begin to seem less straightforward and more troublingly complex. In part 2, We'll examine what happens when forensic scientists look more carefully at the evidence from Beth's murder scene. We'll explore a crucial distinction between two types of evidence, the kind that can be planted and the kind that can't be faked. We'll ask why that pink mohair jumper never left a single fibre at the crime scene. We'll examine why there was no blood from Beth Barnard in the Land Cruiser after such a violent bloody murder. And we'll also hear about yet another phone call that occurred at 10 o'clock that Tuesday morning, the morning after the murder. We'll explore why an entire community closed ranks and refused to speak about what happened, and we'll look at the coroner's findings that ignored crucial testimony. We'll ask the fundamental question that hangs over everything. What really happened to Vivian Cameron? And do those bones found in the sand on January the 15th, 2026 help to solve this mystery? Struth. Thanks so much for listening to part 1 of this episode. Part 2 will be out on Friday. While you're waiting, please feel free to jump into the comments on whatever podcasting platform you use and tell me what you think really happened to both Vivian Cameron and Beth Barnard that night. And while you're at it, make sure you subscribe or follow to ensure that you catch part 2. I'll see you then.